talking. But welcome, I guess, officially to Faculty Research Spotlight. We're super excited. This is the third kind of installment, which is really, really good. One of the things that's been super fun is contrasting, like talking with some new professors and some professors who have been here for a while, and so we're super excited to have Dr. McKay with us today, who's obviously very new. And so if you wanted to start, we'll just do like introductions, if you would like to just talk a little bit about who you are, like what you teach, things like that, and then we also have some students in the audience today, and we'll have them introduce themselves as well. So.
Cool. Thank you for having me. This is so much fun. I am Rebecca McKay. I am a faculty member in the archaeology department. I'm teaching a lot of Latin this year, Latin, Roman history, Greek archaeology as well. For my own research, I'm a Greek prehistorian, so I work on ancient Greece before the time of writing in the Mycenaean period.
Very good. If you guys want to just say hello and introduce yourselves as well.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Turner, and I am a sophomore archaeology major.
Very good.
I'm Kirby. I am also a sophomore archaeology major.
Awesome. And I'm Grace. I'm a junior archaeology and classics double major. So this particular conversation is very exciting for me because this is the first one we've done that's like in my department. And so talking to the other professors was also super, super exciting, but it's fun to be talking to people that it's like, I know a bit more about what we're all about here. So yes, so that's super good. So to kind of dive right in to talk about your research, so you shared with me a little bit of stuff about your PhD dissertation, talking about these like common pool resources and then also like cooperative land use like in the prehistoric like Bronze Age Greece. So if you could just talk a little bit about that, like generally, like what do you research, what kind of evidence do you use, what kind of conclusions are you making, all of it, super cool.
Yeah, so my interest is in common pool resources, which are different than open access resources. They're circumscribed, so there's sort of a defined area that you are sort of engaging in resource procurement and management. And then there's also a defined social aspect. Certain people can use that resource or not. And so I was interested in thinking about common pool resources in the Bronze Age because we have this period that we don't know very much about in the period of state formation and processes that we know have happened where we see privatization of land. And I was interested in how the management of common pool resources, whether we could see these forms of management, the evidence of management, and especially the institutions, the social institutions, that are really important for the management of resources. Rules, how you enforce the rules, who is able to change the rules about procurement. And so I was interested in observing those things and observing those institutions and seeing how it intersects with privatization, seeing how it intersects with the development of the state during the Mycenaean period. So it's a challenge because my question is focused on these things that are completely invisible archaeologically, right? These are social questions, economic questions, and the way people are viewing their resources, whether they're perceived as scarce, whether they're perceived as valuable as a commodity or valuable as a living thing, how they enforce their rules, how that was baked into the social landscape. All those things are, intangible archaeologically. And so I had to sort of cast quite a wide net methodologically. So I looked at a lot of different kinds of data and was able to layer it with each other, and from that sort of get a picture of what was going on in these invisible spaces in these social institutions. And so I can talk with more or less detail about my conclusions. I'll start with less detail, and then we can get more specific. Yeah. So what I found was I looked at two specific common pool resources. The first was forests, and the second is arable lands. And so in both of these contexts, I found that there were sharing institutions, management institutions, that made the resource sustainable and also allowed for more equitable access among resource users. And what's interesting is that they're really persistent these institutions are persistent during periods of Mycenaean history where we see a lot of change. We see a lot of social stratification. We see a lot of ramping up of industrial output. And we see a lot of population growth. So all of these, and also we actually see a lot of climatological change. So all these factors that affect social change and economic change these sharing institutions were sort of impervious to those for a period of time. And then we also have evidence for the state interfering on these sort of community level institutions that managed the resources and sort of facilitated sharing, interfering in a way that benefited the state and destabilized local communities and the institutions themselves. So it, in essence, sort of you can see how durable these institutions are, and then what happens when the state co-opts them for their own gain, and that it has this destabilizing effect. At the end of the Bronze Age, we have a big collapse, so it's hard to say sort of how this would have persisted beyond that in terms of the ecological outcomes. But as it is now, and I can talk, should I go into a little bit more detail about each of these things?
You can if you want to, yeah.
Okay, so for the forests, we see this interesting phenomenon happen where we have pine over a period of about 200 years. During the period where we're seeing social stratification ramp up, industrialization ramp up, we see pine get completely deforested,
Okay.
which is a lower value tree. And then we see oak maintain over this period, even when pine is gone. So there was sort of purposeful and effective rule-making, rule enforcement in terms of procurement of oak. It was sort of protected in a sense. And this I sort of called a moral forest, where you have a certain population or a certain geographical area that's circumscribed and protected that has this intrinsic value. As opposed to like a crop forest where its value is in its being able to be transformed into a commodity.
Right, I see, okay.
And that the moral forest, this forest with inherent good, can only be protected because you are exploiting and extracting from a different population that isn't protected. So we see that with the forests. And then we see ramping up industry, ramping up pyrotechnic requirements, for making ceramics and perfume and all the construction and all the ships and all these things. We see all that ramping up. And we can see from the documentary evidence with respect to the palaces that the palaces decoupling timber from fuel. So whatever the rules there are about collecting fuel and using wood for that purpose, it's not managing, but it is managing procurement of timber.
Like for building or for other
Exactly.
uses, okay.
And we have in the palaces and monumental buildings tremendous amount of oak that was being used structurally. And so it was really taxing on that population that we think would have been protected with these institutions, these sharing institutions. And so they're, by sort of making exceptions for themselves, for their own consumption, you're undermining the institution itself, the cooperative institutions, because you're changing the rules by creating an exception and changing the rules of who gets to change rules, sort of more constitutional, fundamental rules. You're also changing by making an exception for yourself. And then also sort of litigating who is allowed to access it as well. And so the palace is sort of taking these institutions that were really persistent and effective in protecting oak populations, and co-opting them and changing them to serve themselves. And so that undermines the community-based sort of modes of procurement and social landscape. And then for the land, it sort of has the same outcome, but by a different path.
Okay.
So we have evidence in the documentary evidence that we know that there's sort of an idea of communal land, and it's administered by what's called a damos, which seems like it's some sort of cooperative organization that's doing the administration of it. And then we also have private land. We can see that in the documents too. And we have these same social pressures where we have, the climate is getting a little bit drier, population is going up, we're getting more and larger settlements in this period of time of big change. And we also have this extra added force of, the pressure of social stratification and the pressure of sort of individuating yourself compared to people in your community, and accruing more any kind of capital on an individual level. So all those pressures exist. And then we have this added thing, this kind of transaction that I researched quite deeply from the E-series that I argue is an added pressure coming from the palace that incentivizes that individuation, incentivizes privatization, and would undermine the kinds of sharing institutions that the damos, that these collective community lands, how they functioned. It undermines them and makes them less effective, makes fewer people want to opt into those sharing institutions because you have to sort of sacrifice personal profit, a share of personal profit, and you have to sacrifice that sort of drive for individuation. And so it undermines those systems. And so in both cases it's a little bit different, but the palace has this effect of gaining while centralizing, because it's undermining independent economic units and undermining independent economic institutions.
Yeah, okay, so that's so interesting. So it sounds like, just like, I think summarize what it sounds like you're saying. We're talking about these like community oriented like groups that are initially in control just like of these resources in a way that is more like by mutual understanding that this is what we decided is important, this is how we're going to regulate it, and we have these like individuals. And then when the state's coming in, the state's co-opting that, and it's like in the sense of like trying to do it in a selfish way of trying to like put itself above the rules, it actually undermines the entire system. It seems like that's kind of what you're saying.
Exactly. And so they're delicate in some sense. They're persistent in one sense and they're delicate in another sense, because when they're built, if you have sort of mores and traditions and customs that sort of prop up these institutions and make them sort of a smooth element of your daily life, your yearly life, your seasons, then it makes them sort of stronger as there's added pressures that we see in this time, because it's built into your understanding of sort of right and wrong behavior in a social context. But they're also vulnerable because you have to opt in. You have to say, you have to opt into the labor of creating rules. You have to opt into the labor of enforcing rules.
Like it only works by like popular consensus.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So if fewer people want to opt in and they want to do this thing that's incentivized by the state, then the seams sort of start falling away.
Right, no, that makes sense. So you're talking about, when you're talking about all this, all these different, you said you have to cast like a wide net for all this data because this is invisible archaeologically. So I'd like to ask, talk about a bit of some of that evidence that you're pulling in. I know you'd mentioned in the stuff that you sent me, the linear B, which is obviously a very literary type of source, and then also looking at the actual botanical environmental evidence. So how did that work? What were the specific things you were looking at maybe, and then also how did all of those things work together to form this cohesive argument that you're making?
Yeah, it's a challenge. It takes a lot of different things. So, but the good thing about the area that I'm looking at is that there's a tremendous sort of abundance of publication.
Okay.
So where I started is looking at environmental outcomes.
Okay.
So all we can say for sure is how these sort of plant communities changed over time. So that's where I started. So that's from the pollen record. And that gives you a sense of not exclusively how human beings were interfering with their landscape and procuring and what they are choosing. It's a larger picture of what's going on in the local ecology. So from there, I found 3 deforestation events that I deal with, and the third one would be anthropogenic. I was also looking at climatological data, and this is especially important in sort of figuring out which deforestation event was anthropogenic, right? There's massive periods of drought versus sort of more verdant, more abundant times, and so we do have a deforestation event that lines up with sort of towards the end of a 400-year drought. So climatological data, and also thinking about sort of things drying out towards the end of the Mycenaean period, that is an added pressure. There's more asked of your resources because you have more population, you have more tax, you have more burdens by the state, and at the same time you have less sort of irrigation and ability to grow. So climatological data. I also survey and demographic data was really important to estimate. Building these models of consumption was a really important component of it. And so I had to look at, and luckily, Messina has been surveyed and they have such tremendous volume of data that's been published. So understanding populations, population growth, the patterns of the choice of settlements, patterns of the choice and location of settlements was really important, so that's survey data. Ethnographic data is really important because we have, in terms of commons scholarship in general, this is a way to observe the way common pool resources are managed, have been managed effectively, have failed to be managed. And so that ethnographic data is really important. And also that ended up being important for modeling consumption as well, thinking about, really practical things. How much firewood, how many kilos of firewood does it take to make one kiln worth of ceramics? So things like that, ethnography was really important. And then the documentary data from the Linear B. It's one tiny snapshot in one moment at the end of the Mycenaean period. And so it's difficult to sort of retroject all of that, like all of what you can see, all the ways that people are organizing the economy and organizing themselves, retroject that and say that's absolutely true for this larger period that I was looking at,
right.
200-300 year period. But it is an interesting moment if you're seeing trends and then you can see, okay, this is the moment it intersects with this documented, recorded period. And just getting sort of a little glimpse into how that would have manifested in terms of the administration documents. But the Linear B is so much fun. So thinking about those sets and rethinking them and maybe like coming from a different angle was a big component of it.
No, that's awesome. That's super. That's like so. There's so many different kinds of data that's getting pulled into that to get all those details. I think for people who may be like listening or maybe like reading the article later on, like people talking about like pollen and climate and these things, like those are a bit more like concrete. But for people who aren't familiar with Linear B, if you could just talk a bit about like what is it, like how do we study it? Like it's a language obviously, but like what are the complications there, or how does that happen?
Yeah, it's so we have, even though this is like the prehistoric period in Greece, we actually do have writing from this period. That was discovered not that long ago, fairly recently. And this is a script that was developed for a different language and adapted to be used for the Greek language. And because it's been adapted for the Greek language, which has these sort of tangles of consonants and long strings of vowels, it's sort of poorly adapted to it because it's a syllabary. So it means you have one consonant, one vowel pair. And so it means that when you're reading these documents, you know the language, you understand the Greek, but there's a lot missing in terms of how they're conveying the words because it's so poorly adapted to the language that it is. And so there's a lot of room for interpretation and a lot of piecing things together. They're also really laconic. So they're purely administrative documents. They're written by people with esoteric knowledge for people who have that same esoteric knowledge. It isn't meant to be widely understood. So there's a lot of shorthand and there's a lot of just everything's abbreviated and as sort of contained as possible. So these are documents that are used for the administration of the state, of the palace, how they're bringing in resources, how they're sending them out, how they're distributing, how they're spending groups of people, how they're organizing groups of people. And so they're administrative documents, and they tell you a lot about the movement of things, but you have to sort of filter them through this lens of understanding and understand the jargon. So there's a lot of room for interpretation there.
Yeah, it sounds like it's quite complicated. I mean, the idea that it's a language that's being written in a different script. And, I mean, today, like, so few people study ancient Greek to begin with, let alone to study ancient Greek that's actually written not in ancient Greek. Yeah. And then also to have it be abbreviated. I mean, that would be so challenging to have to pull all that together.
Yeah.
So,
It
wow.
makes it a fun puzzle, though. And I also think that it makes it a little bit more accessible because it feels like this community project, and also sort of the scientific process, where people are making educated suggestions about things and arguing for this being that word or this representing this sort of type of organization or concept. But there's no absolute right answer.
Right.
And so it feels like we're all sort of in conversation about it, and that who's to say, you know? And so it feels like it makes it a little bit more accessible in that way too.
That makes sense. With all of this like evidence and different things that you were pulling in together, were you like working with or consulting with like people who were like more specifically like experts in these individual fields, or was it all kind of like you were driving the whole? Because I know it was your dissertation, but like how did that kind of work with all these different things you were pulling in?
Yeah, it's funny. I just had to. I guess it's a little of two things. On the one hand, I knew early on when I was in graduate school that I wanted to do sort of environmental, ecological archaeology. And so I learned from one of my mentors in graduate school, who's an archaeobotanist and has a lab. I learned how to be an archaeobotanist, how to use, botanical evidence to make sort of broader points about the ancient world. And so that allowed me to sort of have this basis of understanding, because, like I said, I'm starting with the ecological outcome. I'm starting with what happened in the environment and then piecing things back together. And so having that understanding, learning from her and learning to be an archaeobotanist in graduate school was the foundation. And then a lot of the other things that I had to deploy, archaeological data, finding that it's oak beams in the Megaron or something, that's pretty straightforward. But a lot of things I did have to sort of learn as I went and just teach myself, because I had this question and it demanded I go in these different directions. So I just had to sort of teach myself.
Yeah, no, that's super cool. And I think that it's like, I think sometimes when people think of like PhD like work, it's like tends to be like this like super narrow focus, which this is. But it's so, like, interdisciplinary, even in, like, this one thing that you were researching. And so I think that's incredibly interesting in of itself.
It makes it fun, right? You're just on this path. Like, you are committed to finding the answer to this question. And it just takes you in all these different directions. And I'm a big believer in sort of demystifying things. Like, if there's some sort of... like economics, for example, is something that feels kind of walled off and special, and it uses a lot of jargon, and it feels impenetrable and inaccessible. I love piercing through that and just being like, you know what, I'm going to figure this out. And so that's one of those things. So I find that process really fun.
That's really
following the question.
That's really cool. So what I'd kind of like to do is like take what you've just talked about, like the stuff that you're doing with your research, and kind of try to like talk about a little bit how maybe it can like relate or kind of compare to like things that are like more contemporary. So kind of some of the things I had thought about was you're studying like ancient environments and the impact of humans on those environments, and that's a big thing that people are studying today, like our impact on the current environment. And so I don't know if you had any thoughts of like how do those things maybe, or how are they similar, how are they different, like is there some sort of relation there at all, or like
Yes, that is a great question. They are so similar, and in fact so this question of how we're impacting our environment, and this is especially pertinent with questions of the commons, right? This is this notion of the tragedy of the commons, and that we're naturally always going to inescapably overexploit to the point where nobody can actually who can benefit from any natural resource. And so in common scholarship, this is all sort of modern observation. These are ethnographies of people who are engaging with a common pool resource in a way that allows it to be, sustainably used, equitable access, persistent over time. These are all questions that people in commons research are thinking about, and so they're observing how people now are engaging with their environment and how they're making choices as a collective. And so this is a lot of things like, fisheries and forests to an extent, but groundwater, these sort of concerns. And so that is sort of, for me, was so central to understanding the ancient material, but I had to sort of reverse engineer it. I did the inverse. So
because you were starting with the result and working toward the cause, right?
Exactly. And so they in these ethnographies, modern commons research, modern environmental sort of political or economic research, they have the things that are sort of impossible for me to reach, which is the way people are thinking about things, what their values are, how much consensus there is in a collective, in a group, what things feel right and wrong to do, what would offend. All of these things I wanted, that's what I was looking for, but I had no access to it. And so the modern world, looking at these ethnographies, was really, really important for me to build my model, which allowed me to look at the outcome and then reverse engineer and look backwards. Okay, if I have this outcome, what does that mean about the social context, the political context? How are people thinking about scarcity? What's scarce, the resource or money or safety, way of life? What are their return horizons? What are they willing, at what point are you willing to sort of sacrifice future profit to make an end meet in the current time? So discounting future returns, and what makes you do that? What social forces, what economic forces, climate forces? And then do those people who are stakeholders have regulatory control? So, from other people who have done common scholarship, including Eleanor Ostrom, one of her arguments is that these arrangements, these management arrangements, are really persistent when the stakeholders are the people who are able to make decisions about the way the resource is used. They are the rule makers.
Mm-hmm.
And so from knowing that, from all these modern ethnographies and modern engagements, then I can plug my outcome in and know all of these things that would have been intangible and inaccessible before. So that's been super, super important for me. And so I do see a lot of overlap in terms of research questions. And we're all asking the same thing. We just have different things available to us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like what you said about the idea that when the stakeholders are the ones who are making the decisions, that it's going to be more kind of more stable, but also more equitable in the sense that if they are deciding as a group that they think it's worth it to risk the future of the crops because they need them now, that's a lot more, I guess you could say, fair even than having when you said a state coming in and co-opting those structures and things like that. So I think that's an interesting observation in the context of so many areas in Greece being trying to be so democratic and make the people who make the decisions are the ones that are impacted versus the idea of these Mycenaean palaces, which were obviously the opposite of that, and that's such a different structure to be working with.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And we see that, this is sort of the condition that we see in U.S. forestry currently. On the one hand, for the Mycenaeans, we do see that there are situations where the stakeholders are making the rules and that those rules are enforced to the extent where we actually do have a major conservation sort of evidence. So, and I would say we don't have that in the U.S., but then in the Mycenaean period, we have this intrusion of the state and that sort of destabilizing some of these things. And it's interesting because, there's Mishan, Nasi, and Balint have this notion of the moral forest versus the rural forest versus the crop forest. These visions, the way you perceive and value the forest, and then also sort of baked in is a sense of sort of what utility you see in them as well. And it feels like in the modern world, and I'll speak about the U.S. because I'm more familiar with it, there's this, there's discord in how these forest visions are, there isn't sort of unanimity in the way people are thinking about their forest and how they're valuing it. So somebody from the city might have a different perspective on the value of sort of an untouched, perfect, pristine forest versus somebody who is engaged in some sort of profit-making or wage-making that requires that you're extracting from the forest. And so people have different ideas about what's valuable about it. And then on top of that, we have this different kind of management where we have, instead of it being like we have in the Mycenaean period, where it seems like community members, stakeholders in their sort of larger geographical area have control over the way these resources are used, we have this like patchwork of ownership in the U.S. where we have like, you know, Fish and Wildlife managing, BLM managing, U.S. Forest Service, and then private landowners are also buying swaths of the forest. And so that all of those different types of management, what they have in common is that in no circumstance the stakeholders are they having control over how it's being used at all. Right? People who would enjoy the forest or forage in the forest or extract from the forest for profit, none of these people are the decision makers in how the forest is, or in a lot of cases they're not the decision makers.
Because they're not the ones who are like owning it, they're being owned by these other.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then there's all these other sort of incentives and things that the state will come and do, you know, how they're going to allocate profit from extraction from these particular sources. And even in sort of areas where there's purposeful conservation, so like national parks and things like that, there's like some of they're trying to serve everyone's interest, you know, foragers, recreation, extraction and logging, beauty, animals, biodiversity, all these things, and some of these conflict with each other. So even when we're trying to sort of purposefully say this circumscribed area is protected, it still is conflicted. And so it's sort of, it's similar and different to the Mycenaean period in that sense.
And it seems like it's almost like, again, like maybe this is an oversimplification, but it seems like it's almost a bit flipped, like in the idea that like in the ancient situation, when the people were in charge, they were conserving it, but when the state was involved, that was like disrupting it. And now it's almost like we do have these like government agencies like Fish and Wildlife, like the national parks that are trying to conserve, and then when it's the private people who are owning it, that is kind of when it's out of control. So it's almost rather like it's flipped a bit there.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. And it's part of it being them being privately owned is that those ultimately are still not really stakeholders. Like they can strip something completely and over extract to the point where it's pointless and then sell that property to a railroad or to someone else who's buying the property once it's stripped. So they can move on. Whereas we have examples in Mexico, there was in the 1970s, the state reallocated like 40% of the physical territory of the state to local indigenous groups. And so I think it was something like 50 million hectares or something was given back to local indigenous groups who owned it and could manage it and weren't supervised by any sort of like higher level state organization. And those are examples where it's privately held, but they are stakeholders because they are the people, if they over-extract to the point of it having absolutely no economic or ecological or moral value, they're the same people who would lose from that situation.
Right, okay, yeah.
And as a result, it's been incredible for the ecology because we see this evidence of them managing it beautifully in a way that they can profit off of. But we have, you know, rebounded canopy cover, and we have increased biodiversity and all these like beautiful ecological outcomes because of that, because the stakeholder is the person with regulatory control. And so we just don't. So yeah, in the privateness of the U.S. situation, a lot of that private interest is still not stakeholder interest.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, and it's also not necessarily people who are like they're not actually tied to that physical land. Like, it's just, like, this is a thing that I own in order to, like, make profit from it, which is a completely different thing than, like, I live on this piece of land and I need to be able to live on it in 50 years. Like,
exactly.
And so it's, like, almost like the commercialization of the land use that I think is also maybe part of the driving force behind that.
Exactly. Exactly. That's exactly right. Because a lot of these companies, they're just going to turn it as quickly as possible and then move on. And it's different. But we also do see this, you know, this question of discounting future returns, you know, making something have less sustainable longevity and utility in the long run to serve an immediate need. We do see that with private landholders who are themselves the stakeholders as well. When we have sort of over extraction from agricultural properties,
Mm-hmm.
and this is something that we saw from the 1970s on, is that they've had all these windbreaks and things to recover from the Dust Bowl between properties so that the soil could stay in place and still be fecund. And there was these sort of state incentives to maximize and like plant fence post to fence post and maximize your extraction of your own property and be growing things that ultimately would end up exported or used as food additives and not as food. And so it's and that to me is an example of people discounting a future return because there's this other incentive, even though they are themselves stakeholders.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. It obviously doesn't bode well either. So there's that aspect of it as well. Kind of, I guess, along that similar line, we're talking about this like division in like the public land and the private land. So I know you're talking a lot about like these common pool resources. So those were things that were held in common, and then like the palaces were kind of co-opting that. So was there a concept of private land like in the time period that you were studying, and like how did that kind of interact with the public resources?
Yes. Yeah, that's a great question. We see they have this name for it, and this is agricultural land, so I don't know how they were regarding, in terms of their lexicon, the forest. But in agricultural land, we have this term that we use for private, which means sort of like settled, like it's this like active sort of like bringing it under control, settling, colonizing, peopling, and in Linear B it's Kiti Mena. And so we have a lot of evidence of these Kiti Mena properties, and it seems like this is at least originally a response to this question of the carrying capacity. Ultimately, you have this bounded sort of community land, and that stops being sufficient for the population as the population grows. And then you also have population break off. You have other settlements that are developing up around you, and that land sort of becomes more hampered, more contained, but also more taxed in terms of its productive output if you have population growth and if you have more dryness. And so it seems like it's a clever move to sort of bring under cultivation land that hadn't been brought under cultivation, hadn't been transformed into something that was cultivable prior, and that this is sort of a response to some of these social changes. But because you have that ability to transform land, if you yourself are giving that investment to move boulders and rip out stumps and terrace, and these are like a lot of front end investments, and if you yourself are willing to be cost that labor and that time, you yourself are going to want to sort of retain all profit 100% rather than pooling profit like we see in the community land. And so that is one of those forces where it creates discord, it creates unsettling, right? Suddenly people who can control their own profit have other abilities in the social landscape where they can, like we were talking about, sort of individuate. You can host, feasting events, and you can sort of get around some of the difficulties of not having a community of people who can do this sort of like naturally collaborative agricultural work, because you have suddenly total control over your surplus, whereas the community land, you probably wouldn't. Because we see in this transaction that the community land is being dealt with in terms of the administration collectively. So if they're pulling from it or adding to it, it's pooled. So the private property owners have a social and political advantage that people in the community wouldn't have had. And then again, that's something that sort of in this particular transaction, which I won't get into, or I can get into it, but it's I'll go all the way down a rabbit hole. For this particular transaction, I think that this is the state sort of capitalizing on that division, where this individual who has land that they've won themselves from the wilds, you can use them to further your distribution enterprises. So it's sort of notional wealth that the state can tap into and redistribute in a way that makes the state looks good. And you're capitalizing on that private property owner's interest in individuating and setting themselves apart and above people in their community, that they have the power to manage their own surplus and spend it as they would. And in addition, there's this added sort of coercive force of participating in this kind of transaction that makes other people indebted to them, and it creates sort of a means of maintaining their own power that also still benefits the state.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, and it's like this very it seems like everyone's benefiting in the sense that like these people who do have this new land, it's like, oh, I have this prestige, I have this like ability to do what I want, and then the state is like fostering that, but then they're also benefiting from it. So I can see how that would just like spiral, really, like keep going, because like like we said earlier, like the community resources, they only work because everyone agrees that they're actually going to do that. And so if you have people who don't agree or don't have to agree, that makes it a lot easier. And I think it's interesting because like the ability to own land and the wealth to own land has always been important, like I think in many cultures, and like even today in America, like if you live on more acres, you have a bigger house, like this is still a big deal. This is still something that we like celebrate and like struggle with, like this idea of like being able to show off with the wealth that you have. And so I think that it's kind of interesting to think about the fact that like that wealth gap was already widening in other cultures like thousands of years ago, that we see widening like in American culture today.
Yes, it's true. Absolutely. It is sort of functioning as this wedge. And especially because there isn't really, it's hard to compete with that social force of like comparison and maybe even envy and competition, especially competition, and where you have a competitive social environment, which I would argue we do in the U.S. now, and certainly true about the Mycenaeans. As a competitive social environment, you're trying to gain advantage in this very performative way, that this becomes the vehicle for competition, and this becomes sort of makes the playing field more inaccessible to get to the place where you can then compete, because you don't even have the means. If you're pooling your resources, you aren't playing the same game that the people are who have the Kitimana land. They're playing amongst each other, they're competing with each other, and you have absolutely no point of access. And so even if you aren't somebody who has private property, you are incentivized to at least even aspire to that, because it makes you a player.
Right.
And there's no way to get into that sort of theater of performance or theater of competition if you have no control of your own surplus. So I think you're absolutely right. This is something that's true now and was true then, and that it is this sort of, it can be a wedge and make something, create a bigger divide, especially in competitive contexts.
Wow. That's like not something that I had thought about like really a lot before, and so that's interesting to think about. Kind of like switching gears a little bit, if you could like take all of this, and like this is obviously so much information and stuff, but if you like could teach like a class or like maybe a couple classes like based on all this, like what would your dream be like to incorporate all this, like if you wanted to tell people about it in a more systematic way? I do have a fantasy of teaching like a paleoecologies class, like for archaeologists. So things that are accessible to you as an archaeologist. So that's like, carbonized plant remains. It's understanding sort of the curation of timber and fuel wood and it's faunal remains, and it's pollen remains, and it's starches and phytoliths, and all these ways that we reconstruct the sort of
the ecology of a period of time as with an eye towards seeing where human beings intersected, where they were interfering in the environment. And so it's all, I like the idea of sort of having it be methodologically sort of focused, thematically. Here are all the tools in your toolkit. And once you know all of the tools that are available to you, it opens up the possibility of questions that you can possibly ask. If you don't know that there's such a thing as a phytolith, you don't know that you can look at a particular, macro-botanical remain and understand irrigation. That's something that's evident in phytoliths, or all these other sort of invisible outcomes. So that would be a class that I would love to teach, environmental archaeology or paleoecology, something like that, for the archaeologist. But also, like an ancient economics class, I feel like it's easy to and important to demystify economics. I sort of keep banging this drum, but it's so much fun and it's so interesting and it's completely accessible, and I want it to feel more accessible to other people. So obviously looking at, Bronze Age linear B documents and other sort of metrics of the economy, of which there are a lot, especially archaeologically. But moving that forward and seeing how things are changing into the historical period, we have an abundance of, documentary, epigraphic evidence where we have sort of I like this sort of nitty-gritty, detailed, jargony kind of documents that we have from ancient periods. We have that carrying forward, contracts and oaths and things like this, that people are, ways that they're engaging economically. So carrying that forward and going sort of into later historical periods with the Greeks and the Romans, I think would be really... Oh, and obviously the Near East.
Those both sound super interesting, and I think they're both cool because in particular the ancient economics, I've never even heard, not that they don't exist, but I've never heard of someone taking a class in ancient economics, maybe in graduate school but not in undergrad, and it's so that's such a cool idea in the sense that like you said, to demystify it, because I think that is something that seems so inaccessible to people, but yet was obviously such a driving force in the ancient world. And so if you can learn just a bit more about economics and what are the questions we can ask there, and then what are these environmental tools you're talking about, and the questions you ask there, because if you like you said, if you don't know what's out there and you don't know what's available, then it does seem like this well, how can we possibly know about the environment? Because I have people ask me that all the time when they talk about studying archaeology, and it's well, how can you really know what X, Y, and Z was back then if you don't know if you're only picturing certain types of evidence as available or as valid or whatever it is, incorporating other things is only going to broaden the understanding that you can have.
Yeah, exactly. And you can just ask questions that are bigger and even more interesting to yourself. And that's all sort of the most important thing, is that you're interested by the work that you're doing.
That always helps, yeah.
But yeah, just opening it up. So I think that those would be fun, and I hope would be useful for archaeology students.
Okay, so I guess switching gears a little bit more, I wanted to talk about some things with graduate school, just again with you being especially a new professor and things like that, to get your take, and so I guess kind of still sticking with your dissertation topic a little bit, but how did you first become interested in what you researched, and how did you pick that topic? Because I think sometimes when people think about whether it's a term paper or an honors thesis or a dissertation or whatever it is, it's easy to feel you're going to get boxed in by that and be well, this is it, this is my thing for the rest of my life, and that's overwhelming, and how do you pick something, and so I think if you just any what are your thoughts, I guess, on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what I recommend for when you're thinking of a topic is always to think about sort of loosen your mind in a sense, so zoom out a little bit and notice what you're attracted to. So notice when if you're reading a syllabus and there's an article and it has this topic in it, when that's the thing you're oh, I can't wait till we get to that. So first notice the things that are sort of delicious, you can't, you'd read it on your own time. Notice what that is. Then have an understanding of what are the big questions in that area. What is the discourse sort of centered on? What are people chewing on? And then think about how you might answer the questions you have about it, and let that guide ultimately what kind of training you want to get to answer that question. So rather than coming in and being like, you know what, I'm going to look at pottery and I'm going to apply a network analysis, and that is my dissertation, and then you're locked in. Sort of, it sounds kind of woo, but just like be driven by the questions that feel you're most attracted to. And then figure out how to answer your questions. And so that means when you choose a graduate school, make sure that you have sort of the appropriate training that you might need. For my own experience, I knew I was interested in property ownership, privatization. It's something that's so always struck me as strange. There's this like very naturally collaborative thing that we do in agriculture, and like how on earth did we decide to carve up the world into little boxes? And so that was my question. And then that curiosity drove me into finding Eleanor Ostrom and people who are doing commons research. And then that drove me into, finding Christine Hastorf at Berkeley, who's going to teach me to be an archaeobotanist and deal with the botanical. So it was always sort of guided by a curiosity, and I would just recommend just zoom out a little bit, and instead of trying to grasp something, a topic, just notice where your curiosity is sort of more potent, and then let that sort of be a key to making your decisions later on.
No, that makes sense, and I think it also kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier with that idea of like following where that leads, like following to the evidence that it leads to, and then like learning to deal with that evidence as it comes. That idea that's like not like, if you're not going to just start with a topic, but actually start with a question that you're interested in, I think that like leaves you open to like maybe to like learn about things that you wouldn't have thought about originally, because if you actually just follow that question that's interesting and exciting to you, it might lead in places that you weren't actually like initially anticipating to.
Exactly. And that's part of the delight of being a scholar and researching, is really earnestly following where the evidence is leading you, and if you see something that feels mushy or feels unsupported, or something that we're taking as granted, that doesn't feel like it's been sort of proven to you yet, just go towards it and just be like, well, let's test it. Well, what if it's this situation? And then sort of try to acquire all the tools that you need to really to answer those questions. That's the fun part.
No, that's good. That's all really helpful things to think about. I guess kind of with like graduate school in general, I guess that's another thing that can be like, it's exciting, it's intimidating, because again, in like, at least in archaeology, it's one of those things where most people come to the realization, at least at some point, that if they want to like do archaeology in any serious sense, they're going to need to go to graduate school. And that's not necessarily for everyone, but it's like, even for people who are excited about it, can be very intimidating. And so I guess, do you have any like general thoughts about grad school, and like in general, just like advice, things like that, like for people, in addition to what you've said about like starting with a question and like looking for people and places that can help you find it? But.
Yeah. So are you thinking sort of practically or like philosophically?
I guess either one.
Okay. I think on a practical level, it's really important that you have funding.
It's like always the bottom line, isn't it?
Yes, it really is, because it's hard enough with the, as graduate students, even in funded programs, you are not paid enough.
Right.
And it's already hard. And so make sure you get funding. You don't want to go into debt. Finding an advisor. So your advisor is somebody you might want to reach out to, who you'd want to work with before you even apply. And that's somebody who, they don't have to do everything that you do, but you can like the way that they think, like their process for research and scholarship, respect their work, and having an advisor who is going to give you the freedom to follow your curiosity, which is why you're there. You're not there to do, somebody else's research. You're there to do your own. So somebody who's going to support you in following your curiosity and support you in all of the things that make graduate so hard, which is, the unrelenting stress, being time poor, being poor, all those things, somebody who's going to really have your back. So it's really it has to do with their area of study to an extent. and it has to do with what kind of person they are as well. So that's really important, is finding an advisor who has your back.
How do you, like, recommend to people, like, because I know you said, like, you reach out, like, before you apply, like, how do you get a sense for that? That's maybe probably a hard question, but it's one thing to say, like, I read this person's, like, CV and I think that they do interesting work, but, like, that idea of, like, as a person, like, can you get along with this person for however many years? Like, I suppose you would have to meet them, and, like, how, you know, like, how would you get an accurate sense for that?
Yeah, you are going to get a sense if you reach out and they respond to you. And
that's always a good sign.
That's always a good sign, and that they're kind and they're interested in what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good sense. I think that also reading people's research, it actually isn't decoupled from who they are as a person, because you're understanding how somebody thinks when you read their work. And so somebody who's really creative or is sort of pushing a particular sort of line of thought that maybe is cutting edge or something like that, you can learn about them and admire them. So yeah, reaching out and also you can reach out to people who are currently those people's students, or people who are currently in a program that you're interested in, and see what their experience is like, and see if they'll tell you honestly. But yeah, having a good advisor, and of course that person needs to be somebody whose work overlaps with yours enough where you get something out of it. So the people on my dissertation committee, my advisor was Kim Shelton, who's an incredible, Mycenaean archaeologist. I have so much admiration for her and her work, and she's taken such good care of me as a person. But also I had people who are, historians, people who do epigraphy, like way outside of my time period, because they had, or Christine Hastorf works in South America, so it's different, but it's piecing together sort of a team of people that you can learn from, and you can ultimately get everything you need. If you want to be a bioarchaeologist, make sure there's a bioarchaeologist in the department that you're working, or in some department in your school that you're applying to. So yeah, it's sort of a issue of matchmaking. I think on a philosophical level, and this goes back to sort of what we were talking about picking a topic, it is, you have to sacrifice a lot as a graduate student. And it is costly in every way that it can be costly to a person. It costs you of your time, it costs you of your sort of well-being in some sense, because it's incredibly stressful. And your confidence, too. It can be costly of your confidence. So my recommendation is make sure that it is the thing you want to do above all else is research, and think about the questions that make you curious, and think about whatever the topic is. If that, you couldn't imagine not doing that and not having your job be to think about that, I wouldn't do it, because it's only pays off if you're getting a lot of meaning out of the work that you're doing.
Right.
You're not, you can't, there's a lot of things you have to give up, but if it feels like this is, when you go ABD, you're like allowed to start working on your own dissertation, you finish your quals, blah, blah, blah. It is such a joy if you've been just waiting to do this, answer this question, or get into this kind of data, or just dig in. It is a joy to reach that point. If you're not really driven in that way, and it doesn't give you tremendous meaning, it can be overwhelming to be, suddenly I'm ABD, I have to produce, a 400-page paper on a particular topic and be an expert in it. That's daunting and horrifying. And so it just comes down to, like, are you going to get out of it what you have to put into it? And so that's just a personal question you have to ask yourself. So, but that's an important reflection to do before you apply.
No, that makes sense. And I think that one thing that I think is nice about, like, at least at our department here, if not others, is that, like, because we do so much research and we do so much writing, I think that can kind of maybe help people get a sense for that. Because, like, you'll talk to people, like, in departments or other departments, and they'll say, like, oh, I really don't like writing papers. And it's like, well, it's probably a good thing that you're not studying X, Y, and Z. Because, like, if you are studying X, Y, and Z, and that's a requirement,
it's like there's no way around
it's only going to get bigger in graduate school.
Exactly.
So I think that's maybe a good tool for people too. It's just like, well, what do you think about what you're doing right now? And
Yeah.
if you don't like it, then you may not want to keep doing it
Yes.
in graduate school because it's only going to get harder.
Exactly. And I remember that, you know, and this might be your guys' experience as well, but I remember when I was in undergrad, you know, you have your normal dread for writing a paper because it's, you know, it's taxing of your brain and you don't want to do it. It's time consuming. But I remember getting into a flow when you're writing, and I remember saying out loud to my roommates, I'm having the best time. Like you get into it and you have your ideas and you just can't wait to express them. You know, like that, I remember that so clearly. And I do think that, because I took a lot of time off before I went to back to graduate school. And so that was one of the things that felt like was propelling me, is this hunger to do that thing, and how good it felt to be in that flow. And knowing that if I got to do that, even if I was, you know, working 90 hours a week and living in someone's basement, true story, you know, that my life would be joyful and it would feel meaningful. So that's just something you have to ask yourself. But you're absolutely true that this is a test. If, you know, if you're doing the humanities, or if you're, whatever you're doing, if the central part of it you are uncomfortable with or you have a dislike for, yeah, to your point, it's just going to get harder and harder.
Yeah, I think all of that, like the practical and the philosophical stuff, is all really good, very helpful things. And I think that, like you said, like eventually it has to be a question that you ask yourself and a decision that you make yourself. But like having like professors who can like give their insights about having gone through it, I think is really, really helpful. And so that's, I think, going to be a really good thing for people to be able to read about and hear about.
Good.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
I guess the one last thing that I wanted to ask, maybe like a bit of a fun question to add on, is that like this idea of like traveling to do the research, like with you being in Greece and things like that, like that's something that, at least for archaeology, I think a lot of people like dream of. And so I wasn't sure if you maybe had any like particularly fun like memories or anything, like, or like things that you just really enjoyed with like being able to do that with that traveling.
It is a tremendous joy. It is so much fun. And it is one of those things where it's like you're working really hard, but it's the best kind of work. It feels important and it feels meaningful, and you're exhausted, but in a good way. So it's all amazing experiences. I think, speaking sort of generally, the things that I love the most are working with students and seeing people get excited about archaeology and sort of follow their curiosities and integrate them into sort of the interpretive work that we're doing as archaeologists, even in the field, even before you sort of start processing things. So working with students is amazing. It's my favorite thing. But also I think the experience that stands out to me as being sort of the most delightful was, I think, my first summer in Greece. It's hard to compete with your first summer in Greece. It's like, you know. But it was 2016, and I was working at Mount Lycaon, and I was not originally meant to work in the field. I was working in the museum side. And I was brought up to work in the field, and we were on the very tippy top of one of the highest mountains in the Peloponnese. And looking out, you can see sort of like islands in the Ionian and everywhere. You can see all of Arcadia, Temple of Bassi. I mean, the view was just unbelievable. It was so beautiful. And we were screening 100% because it's this ash altar, so we were screening everything 100%. And so you'd be out there, and what's so wonderful that I love about archaeology is that you have these long, long, long hours where you're working alongside people and sort of falling in and out of conversation and learning about each other and talking about your ideas. And so it's like this foundation for this like sort of wonderful, intimate friendships that you have with your colleagues. And I just remember like up there was like not even a blade of grass for shade. I mean, you were just like baking. And we were out there screening 100% everything on these stones. And just everyone sort of getting a little bit sun-baked, like your brain's getting baked, and everyone getting really, really loopy and just like writing weird songs and like just like laughing. And so I love those kinds of moments where it's like we're doing something really cool and we're all excited about the work that we're doing, and we're also kind of silly nonsense people and just goofing around. So yeah, I loved my first summer there. That's true of all archaeology. archaeological experiences, but I just remember that one in particular because we're sitting on those stones, just losing our minds.
No, but it makes sense, and like you said, like, it's hard to beat like the first time you do
Yeah.
something like that. So that
Yeah.
is like it sets like that's kind of a high bar.
Yeah.
So that is such a fun memory. I was in Greece this past summer for the first time, and that was I really liked you said like it's hard to beat your first summer in Greece. It's like
Yeah.
that's true. Like
Yeah.
that was really magical. Like being able to see all of the different places that we did see, and like the experience of like like going through this like with together. Like I remember we went to I think it was when we went to Tiryns, and Tiryns was the second Mycenaean palace of the day,
Mm-hmm.
and it was 107 degrees, and we
Mhm.
all looked at each other and we went, are we really doing this? Like, are we really climbing the second Mycenaean palace of the day in 107-degree heat? And like, there's just like certain moments where it's like, oh yeah, like here we go. Like
Yep.
there's nothing really can beat that. So
Yeah.
that's a really fun, that's a good
I
story.
really relate to sweating a lot on Tiryns.
Yeah. So there's no shade there either. It's
Yeah.
just like, there's nothing there. It's
Yeah.
just the walls. But yeah, wow.
Yeah.
All right. Any last thoughts? Anything
Mm.
else that you wanted to hit in before we wrap up?
Not that I can think of, and I feel like I've been blabbing for like
No, this
4
has been so
hours.
interesting.
So I don't want
No,
to keep you
it's
guys
so
any longer,
interesting.
but yeah, I'll just say thank you for inviting me. I'm just so
Mm-hmm.
honored to be part of the spotlight, and I had such a good time talking about all this with you.
Yeah, no, this has been super, super enjoyable for me to be able to like hear again about what all the things that you're doing, and just to actually be able to like sit and talk about it and like back and forth and stuff like that. I think it's been so interesting. So thank you again for being willing to do this, and we're super excited to be able to like to have this for people to watch, to people to listen to for the article and things like that. And I
Great.
can't wait to see like where it keeps going and stuff like that. We're bringing in Dr. Clark from the same department next, and so that's gonna be really exciting to like maybe be able to like contrast and compare like what the
Yeah.
two of you are doing and things like that from the same department with these two new professors. And so no, it's really, really exciting.
That's
So,
great.
Thank you again.
Thank you. This was
Yay!
fun.
All right.